Well, welcome everybody. Thank you, Jodell or Jodell Onstott, for being here. Uh, Jodell is a spiritual counselor and a writer, author of the book Yahweh Exists. If I'm not mistaken, it's a 1,200 page book. Is that true?
Yeah, just a little bit of reading, not much at all.
Which is, yeah, I mean, that's pretty incredible that you were able to fill that many pages. But I definitely agree with the title. And I was reading a little bit of your introduction. And, you know, I think that there's nothing more important than that acknowledgement, simply because whether or not people believe in God, um, they do acknowledge that it's the most important question, you know, because it's extremely significant. And there's the question of does God exist? And then there's the question of, well, who is God, right? And so I think you answer both of those questions in your title. God is Yahweh and Yahweh exists. But particularly, I was told that you were one of the leaders of a new community of ex-Christians who were Christian for many years, but basically came to the conclusion that the Torah is the foundation, and that's what we should be following. And I think that's particularly fascinating and important because Christianity is essentially a branch of Judaism, and all branches of Judaism, when taken to their logical conclusion, uh, should come to the conclusion that the Torah is the foundation and what needs to be followed, considering it's literally the beginning. And it says in the Torah, do not add or subtract to these commandments. So everything's laid out pretty clearly from the beginning. And so, yeah, if you can just tell us more about that, I think it's fascinating because at this moment, we need unity between the monotheistic faith,
Yes,
and you know that that unity can only come through the foundation being the Torah.
absolutely. I think it's just so overlooked. I find both within Christianity and Judaism, the Torah is really kind of denigrated. Many rabbis that I talk to, they don't even see the Torah as something that is defines anything. It's just kind of like, oh, here's some basic suggestions God threw at us. Take what you want and leave the rest. And in Christianity, it's the idea that it's rigid, it's too hard to do, and it's something that is actually not life giving. It's the exact opposite. It's death. So that's why I actually had a book that just came out about 3 weeks ago. And the title of that is Does Jesus Exist? Because, in volume one, I tried to establish that Yahweh exists. So the next logical question is, where does Jesus fit in? So that's kind of what this series is dealing with. But in that question, I go through even the New Testament and I show where even the New Testament regards the Torah as foundational, as life giving, as key to everything else, and not oppressive in any way. So I think we just have to challenge a lot of our inherited ideas, kind of, what Jeremiah encourages us to do, and with that, we really have to return to the foundation of an Abrahamic faith. And it's something that I think can transcend, like you said, Judaism and Christianity, but also possibly even Islam, because all of them really come from that core Abrahamic faith. And when we return to that, there's just so many thousands of years of human interpretation, every group, every sect, and this is something that I've kind of found, and I've even wrestled with it myself, is that once you become a group of people, and once you have, 10, 15, 20, 30 people, you begin to question and ask, well, how do we identify ourselves? How do we set ourselves apart so people know who we are? So you have all these different names that are given, and but it's like none of those are ones that God defined us. That's not the identity He gave to us. So I find that when you return to a Torah-based faith, for me, I like something like the name Torah Observant Israel, or I don't know, just something that really resonates with the idea that yes, there's Torah, yes, there's God, but it's more than that. It's a meaningful way of life that we actually live. We actually do it. And so many of us have inherited this idea that it can't be done. Even within Judaism, there's the idea, oh, those laws, they're just too onerous. They're past their time, they're no longer relevant today. And no matter where you look, everybody says it's too hard, it's too colloquial, it's outdated, rather than saying, well, maybe there's like if God took the time to give us a written instruction, to give us something that he spoke from Mount Sinai with the covenant, and B, if you take those 10 categories and you develop them into an actual legal code, something that would be similar to the Hammurabi Code or something that even parallels the Hurrian laws or Hittite laws, you find something that it actually is. It's not just this generic teaching, it's actually a legal text. So how, and this is the question that I often ask when people want to make it just a teaching and not anything definitive, is throughout the Tanakh, we have all these situations where people are punished for violating something that we have that's written down, whether it's specific instructions on how to keep the Sabbath, whether it is committing murder. I mean, these are very, very specific instructions that are being violated, and there's punishment that goes along with it. You can't have a functioning society where all you have are generalized teachings. If you're going to have a civil society where crimes are held accountable, it has to be a written, legal, black and white text. Now, there can be debates on how to interpret it and how to apply it to new situations, but those that are defined within that framework should be pretty clear and simple. So I think when we return to that core, that, okay, it is a legal text, is a legal text that goes beyond legality in the fact that there's a unifying philosophical precept and a way of life here. I think that just unifies, it can unify the entire world into something that is very peaceful. The ultimate prophetic vision where nations beat their swords into farming tools. And we no longer have, these conflicts that we're having in Israel today and these enemies like with Iran. Rather, it's that love of God and that unity of philosophy that really makes us a cohesive but separate and different populace that really has the love of God as its foundation.
Amen. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, that's very well said. And coming from the Jewish perspective, you're absolutely right. They actually mock the Torah, and they say that it's not understandable and that God failed to communicate with totality uh, in the five books of Moses. And they're like, oh, if you read that, that's just like a couple of pointers. But if you want to know the real revelation, you got to go open the 10,000 books of the rabbis, where they sit there and debate all of these unlikely scenarios and come to their own arbitrary conclusions. That would be the true revelation. And again, as you say, that's just a denial of what's actually going on in the Torah. And it's no coincidence that Christians, Muslims, and Jews don't really read the Torah. They're always absorbed in their own texts, in their own commentaries. And of course, what is the purpose of those commentaries? To bring up their own ego, to bring up their own name, to advance their own agendas, to identify themselves in some way outside of the identification that God created. And so, Torah observant Jew, or sorry, Torah observant Israel, is actually a much better terminology because it resonates with the text. The text calls the congregation of Israel Israel. Israel means to struggle with God and with man and to succeed. And so it goes right down to the core of the nature of the people of the covenant. And the Torah is the term for the law, which is the five books. And that is the foundation that could like there is no denying that if humanity kept the Ten Commandments, there would be no murder, there would be no stealing, there would be no adultery, there would be there would be unity in God, there would be unity in worship, there would be rest on the seventh day, there would be honoring of parents, like all of these things that people laugh at as being obvious, yet they don't do, right? It's like,
Yeah, well, yeah, and that's um, I think that's the cloak that everybody hides behind because we resort to, oh, they're a good person. And hear that phrase everywhere is, somebody dies. Oh, but they were such a good person. But then I kind of, look back in their life and especially when it's somebody who has this very turbulent life. And I look at the decisions that they were making and whether or not those decisions are in line with the Tanakh, specifically the Torah. And I find that they're not. And I'm like going, okay, so we broad swipe this. We just resort to generalities. And I'm like going, how healthy is that really? Rather than, I understand we can always be way too judgmental, but a little bit of judgment can provide a lot of wisdom that helps us to avoid a lot of pitfalls, a lot of traps, and a lot of decisions we would make for our own personal lives that have very poor outcomes. So I think that we have to rethink this they're a good person mentality and base that idea of a good person. Well, how much do their actions coincide with the law? And, I've had lots of friends over the years, and I've found that about 90, maybe 95% of the time, when a person is walking and obeying Torah, their life is one of peace, it's one of joy, it's one of economic prosperity. It's one where they often have good health. Not all the time, but I think, there's other factors that play into that. We won't get into that today because that's a whole other rabbit trail. But I do find that there's a direct correspondence. I think modernly we call it karma, but biblically it's this idea of reaping and sowing what you do. And everything in the Torah teaches us how to sow healthfully so that we reap that positive outcome.
absolutely. Yeah. And again, when it comes down to these laws, it's easy to say, oh, no judgment. And of course, the people that say no judgment are always judging, and people are always judging. They'll even judge other people for judging, which is in and of itself a judgment. However, the Torah teaches us how to judge faithfully, how to judge correctly. And, it's not even our own judgments. That's the thing, is like, you wouldn't necessarily come to these conclusions with such clarity if you didn't have a revelation. And the whole premise of the Torah is this is a real story and it's real history that's been accepted by the entire region of the world where this story took place. And it's the history. And God actually did speak to the Israelites on Mount Sinai. And that's a real story.
And that really comes down to the heart of the matter. So in 1999, I had a very much a crisis of faith. I didn't know if I was going to, well, I was more or less atheist for a short period of time. And then I kind of went agnosticism there for a while. So it all came down, are these stories real? Is this a history? Is it accurate? And that led me to archaeology. So I started, um, first of all, I had before you can date anything and say, this fits, it doesn't fit, you have to have a valid chronology. So I delved into all the works out there, all the theories on chronology, and I actually found a chronology that totally coincides with both the text, totally coincides with the dating of Assyrian chronology. There's a few things, but like for instance, take Ahab, for instance, and his contact with Shalmaneser, and later I think it was Sennacherib. I haven't looked at it in a while, but when you look at that specific chronology, it is to the year, 23 years to the date, Jehu's ascension. Everything is absolutely exact. And if anybody's interested, I have that on my academia page where you can go and look at that and see for yourself just how accurate that history is. There's other synchronisms. Some of them I've written about, some of them that I haven't, that show just how real this is. when we look at the dating of Shechem and its destruction layers, we find that it matches the same chronology in scripture. And most of your destruction layers throughout Israel, and even when we look maybe towards Averroes in Egypt, all of those datings continue to coincide with what is recorded in the text. Now, I will say, and I don't really quite understand why this is such an issue. The dating that I have come up with is about 200 years earlier than most scholars. Takes us back to about 1550 BCE for the Exodus. And for some reason, this idea of an early Exodus is very threatening. I'm not sure why. I think maybe because there's an association with the Hyksos, and that association is seen to undermine the biblical text rather than support it. So I think maybe there's just assumptions that are there. I'm really not quite sure. But that really was the key piece for me before I could even delve into the Torah and say, okay, does this contain truth? I first had to establish, is there a core of historical validity that I can sink my teeth into, that I can actually stand on and build from there and say, yeah, there's something here. So, and I did find that.
Well, that's obviously encouraging. And it goes even prior to the Exodus from Egypt, even just tracing the history that the Torah, the Bible traces, which is about the past 6,000 years. Those narratives, the garden, the creation, the flood, the Tower of Babel, those are ancient myths that align with uh, this timeline. And you're finding variations of the same, and yeah, there may be deviations by a couple hundred years or in details, but ultimately it's the same timeline and the same chronology that's being accepted by the entire region. And you even have like some of these myths in Africa or even further away where it's very clear that there is a divine hand in the creation of this world, and some mass creation event took place 6,000 years ago, and there's this flood destruction, and there's this Tower of Babel dispersion, and when it comes to the Exodus from Egypt and all these things. Now, you're always going to have scientists who debate it, and you're always going to have Bible critics who read the Torah and are like, "Oh, there's 7 different authors here." It's like, well, yeah, that's your dumb opinion. Like I've read the Torah and I see cohesiveness beyond any other book that I've read. And when it comes to these original narratives, the Torah is the most reliable source because it's coming through Moses. And if Moses is the one who's recording this original history, Moses, who's the one man that speaks directly to God face to face over a 40-year period, he's going to be the one you want to trust regarding what really happened, with Adam and Eve and Noah and Abraham. And again, we live in a time where people scoff at believers, and
Mhm.
you know, it's not about other people's opinions, but I think one way to diminish the joke that religion has become is to at least identify what are we getting behind? Like, what do we actually believe in? And then what can we what can we reasonably say? Yeah, that's hogwash. That's like religious fundamentalism or like, religious extremism or delusion. And I think that the reason why the Torah is something that I can get behind, to use your term phrase, is because I find the Torah to actually be reliable. I find the words there, the revelation, to be consistent, to be coherent, and to actually breed results, reward and punishment, and all of that. So, um, tell me a little bit about how you see the Torah being so much more valid versus when it comes to like Yahweh exists, but then the question is, well, does Jesus exist? Or say, do the rabbis exist? Like, do all of these later authorities who say put themselves in the way between the individual and God say, I am the way, the truth, and the life, only through me can you get to the Father, which is what Jesus says, which is what the rabbis say, only through us can you get to God and understand the Torah and all that. What is the primary distinction between the Torah and these later texts coming around 1,500 years later?
Let me start somewhere at the very beginning because I find that when we are at the point of the flood, and you kind of have this demarcation where we have, every nation, as you say. And even you can even find some of these myths in South America, where there's this idea of a flood, maybe even this idea of the world in one language, and it scatters. So how do we interpret this? How are we to understand it? And I find there's a very big divide because if there's one of two categories you're going to fall into. You're either going to see that the ancient world had truth. Everybody at one point in time knew God, and there was a mechanism to preserve that. Or you're going to see that nobody ever had truth, and it was just all of a sudden revealed to Abraham very kind of, out of the blue, and there's no other bigger picture at play. The other thing that's interesting when we do talk about the flood and the Tower of Babel, when we go further, when you go through the Genesis chronology, you find that quite a few of the patriarchs actually die all in the same year. Well, what event would that have been? That would have been probably the destruction of the Tower of Babel that year, because everybody all of a sudden has these short lives where everybody lives these long lives. Also, according to the Genesis chronology, Abraham would have been, I'm sorry, rather, Noah would have been alive until Abraham was 58 years of age. Shem would have been alive until Jacob and Esau were 55 years of age. What this is important because it shows that were people there, these original patriarchs, to guide and preserve truth. But as their lives come to an end, it makes sense that God would want to reestablish someone who could preserve that truth, who could transmit it to his descendants, and who would actually care about it. So when you see that process in that light, it makes sense. And when we come then into the Torah and the idea of, yes, God established Levites to teach the people. Yes, he gave Levites to hold the people accountability. And that really is what I see the whole entire purpose of Torah. It is one of accountability. And that is why nobody really likes it, because I can't make up my own religion. I can't make up my own idea of right and wrong, because if I do, I'm going to violate what's written. And that's why every group, every sect out there tries to just shove it under a rug, diminish its importance because they don't want that accountability.
What
Now,
I've noticed is that they will then still use the authority of the Torah though to justify their own religion. Be like, well, we attach the Torah to our religion, so look, it's the Torah, it's God, but also we're going to say whatever we want about it, and our interpretations are gospel, you know.
Absolutely. But and this is something again, as I mentioned before, with attributing a name to yourself. When you look at a group of people, and once they attach a name arbitrary to Torah to themselves, all of a sudden that movement kind of goes in a sideways direction. Calvinism, everybody followed a man, Calvin. Baptists, everybody follows, this particular thing. And they lock themselves into a box. And sometimes, God's revelation of our understanding, or rather what we find maybe from other ancient texts, it's not necessarily locked in time. Sometimes we do have to be a little bit malleable in that our understanding increases and we have a better way of applying that Torah or that understanding, maybe because some inscription has been uncovered that gives us greater depth and understanding of that. But when we look at the role that man tries to play, the power, because that's really kind of what it comes down to, they try to usurp. I'm always drawn back to Deuteronomy 30:11 through 19. And that is such a powerful verse. I know for me, I use it modernly in its modern context, showing that nobody has to go get it for us, that we can hear it and do it. Nobody has to really explain it to us. It's really very easy. It's very close to us that we can hear it and understand it. Now, what was interesting though, when I was going through that text, I asked, okay, so if Moses is saying this to the people, 1550 BCE, or even, around 1500 BCE, what is the prevalent idea that he was challenging, because this sounds very something that would relate to Israelites during his day. And I began to find a lot of cogency with that challenging that nobody has to get it for us, um, with the Epic of Gilgamesh and some of the ideas that are in there. That, Gilgamesh has to go over the sea, and get eternal life and bring it to you,
Mm. The one man doing it, yeah,
but
forever.
not just one man doing it, but it's there that we find this idea that it's too onerous. He was supposed to stay awake after going through all these travels. He was supposed to stay awake day and night. I think, what is it, 6, 7 days? And he couldn't do it. The task was too great, and he failed at obtaining eternal life. So, right there, we have Moses, who is challenging that ideology for Israel. And that ideology hasn't gone anywhere. It's still there. We've still inherited. Yes, it's been washed through different religious movements, through different eras of, religion as it comes and goes, but the core ideas are still there. And the message that we can actually, look to the text, get to know God, have a relationship with Him, and we don't have to have, a teacher lording over us, or give power to a man or a group of people to be over us, for us to have that relationship with God, for us to know Him and to walk in His ways.
Exactly. And it's fascinating that you bring up Deuteronomy 30, because in the beginning of Deuteronomy 30, it describes the redemption process, where Deuteronomy actually foretells the mass exile of Israel across the entire world. And the description of the redemption is not a Messiah, not a single individual who is going to save everyone else. Rather, you and your children must return to God with all of your heart and all of your soul, and then He will return your exile and have mercy and bring you back to the land and make you even greater than your ancestors, right? And so what we're talking about here is the individual and the family unit returning to God, empowering each and every person in their home with their children to return to God, which is an entirely different picture than what we're getting from the religious institutions, which is, again, the Gilgamesh figure, the demigod Christ. Christ is a demigod who ultimately dies on a cross, right? And so, like, what is the image of Christianity? A dead man on a cross, right? What is the image of the Torah? The days of heaven on earth, right? The accessibility, the 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 possibility for success and the necessity to achieve it, and that's like that's what's so interesting to me when you read the Torah, especially this kind of black and white. I place before you the life and the death, the blessing and the curse. Choose life, and the choice is clear the way it's being put to us, and the results are immediate. And people are like, well, look at the world, it's so depressing. And it's like, well, are people following God? Are they fulfilling His will? Is Israel actually upholding the Torah? No. So you can't say that it doesn't work until you try it. And if God gives a promise, I would take Him at His word. And I just wanted to point out this idea that you were talking about the patriarchs, um, having a lineage of awareness of Yahweh. There's the statement in Genesis chapter 4, verse 26, when uh, Seth, who is the third son of Adam, we have Cain and Abel. Cain kills Abel. Cain's a pretty bad guy. He actually doesn't end up surviving the flood. Him and his bloodline don't survive the flood. It's Seth, who is the grandfather of Noah. Seth has a son named Enosh, and it says here, Seth also begot a son, called his name Enosh. Then they begun to call in the name of Yahweh, right? And so you have, like, Adam, obviously is aware of Yahweh's created directly by his hand, and then his son Seth, and then Enosh, and then they're calling in the name of Yahweh all the way through Noah. And so, yeah, clearly there's a very reliable tradition for this, and it's only man's deviance from this fundamental narrative that causes the breakdown.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think we are made in Jehovah's likeness. We're made in His image. Um, and with that, we also want his power. We want his authority. We want to go that next step and we want to be God. And the way we do that is by having power and authority over other humans. And that's why people try to manipulate the text, because the moment you deviate from it, you really pollute it. And there's this, there's this inherent need that we have because we want to be a part of a group. The old adage, birds of a feather flock together. But also within that, we have to be careful because there's this tendency to want everyone to march lock and step, to dress the same way, to look the same way, to act the same way, to have the exact same traditions. Um, for me personally, I see God, I look at creation and I see a God who makes a hippo, he makes a giraffe. I mean, he obviously has a sense of humor. You look at some humans like me, and you're like, he really has a sense of humor. So when you look at his creation, I just don't find any from the written Tanakh or even from the creation around us, this idea where the application of Torah, like say our traditions with the Sabbath or our traditions with what we do in our daily lives that are not specifically mentioned in the Torah. I don't find where we have to be lock and step, where we all have to have the exact same tradition. I think a community is so much stronger when it's the beliefs that unite you, but maybe you celebrate the Sabbath a little bit differently. Maybe you have a different custom. Just recently we had a youth retreat with our little group, and there was only about maybe 15, 20 kids, but it was really neat because we were exposed to another family's way that they have their own traditions and their own way of doing things. And I enjoyed it. It wasn't for me, but I enjoyed that exposure. And you know what? If it's something I really enjoy, I can kind of change what I do and adapt. I can adapt, I can adopt, and it'll be to my kids whether or not they take that and run with it, whether they find something that works better for them. But the key is that we're doing it, that we are, sanctifying the Sabbath, that we're walking in Torah, and we're following Yahweh's commands as best we know how. Now, I do think that with the redemption in Deuteronomy 30, and that's also talked about in Zechariah 14, that you have Isaiah and Amos, who they all talk. As a matter of fact, in Yahweh Exists Volume 1, I do have, I think it's like 10, 15 texts that I quote, and I show this focus on this future redemption to the land where people all of a sudden they've gotten so tired of sin, so tired of these cycles of violence and of dysfunction in families, dysfunction in the world. They're finally willing to obey. They're finally like, okay, we've tried everything else. Maybe we can give God a shot. And with this and this redemption, they really get on the right track. And with that, they're no longer afraid of the accountability. We no longer look to man, but there will be a restoration of a priesthood. I mean, Jeremiah tells us that. And yes, at that point in time, there will be some authority, there will be some sort of governance and some sort of structure. But from what I see in history, when we try to do that on our own, we try to set it up outside of what Yahweh has given, it leads to oppression every single time.
Yes, 100%. And I was talking to a rabbi yesterday, and he's like, "Well, according to what you're saying, there is no uniformity in Judaism." I said, "Yeah, exactly. There doesn't need to be, right? The whole point is, as long as you are not breaking the explicit commandments, you are given the freedom to conduct yourself as you wish." And I love your example from nature itself being the most complex array of different life forms and creatures, and with such different looks and different behaviors. And within humanity itself, there's so much vastness in race and you know culture and everything. So of course, like, what's wrong with that? It's such a bizarre idea. And that idea that, oh, humans want to be like God is the story of Eden, right? That's the snake's proposal to Eve. If you get this knowledge that God tells you not to take, then you'll be like God. Then you'll know good and evil. Then you'll be the one who could decide what's good and bad, as opposed to letting God decide, and then you can actually eat from the tree of life and have eternal life, right? Which, by the way, in this story, eternal life is just given to you. It's like right there in the midst of the garden, right? But if you're gonna disobey God, that's where you get, thrown out, and now you're left to your own devices, and it's really just a life of sorrow and pain and difficulty for both men and women in their respective roles. Um, so, that's clearly where we're at. And the redemption arc is, as you say, at what point have you had enough? Like people always say, well, this is how the world is. That's how people are. It's like, yeah, well, people can change and people need to change in order for the world to change. And everyone wants things to be different. Yet, what is it going to take? It's absolutely going to take this universal truth entering into man. I think Jeremiah speaks of the consciousness that enters man, where no longer do I have to say to my fellow, "Oh, there is God," but rather the knowledge of God is within everyone, and the Spirit of God is within everyone, and all the nations. Isaiah says all the nations stream to the temples, stream to worship before God, and the principles that God has taught Israel will enlighten everyone. And that's certainly a worthwhile redemption, and it lacks the corruption of men because it's a unified return to God Himself.
Amen. Micah actually states that we will vanquish our iniquities. So it is the idea that we've been through this dysfunctional cycle so much, and I so much of the time I use women and marriage relationships for what I see to be a great example for the broader spectrum of life. A woman will get with a very abusive man. He thirsts for power, control. He has, a very weak ego. He's a very weak man. So to bump up his own self-esteem, he seeks to dominate her, control her life, and have something where he can be God in that situation. And some women will wake up, they will mature, they will get the resources they need to get out and to no longer be in that dysfunctional situation. Other women stay. And sometimes they stay and they just deal with it. Other times they stay and they end up dying because they stay there. And we see those same types of situations all throughout the world, where there are dysfunctional governments, there's dysfunctional families, dysfunctional school systems, everything's dysfunction, but that dysfunction is a symptom of sin. It is a symptom of departing from the way. And again, the way isn't just this nebulous, what is it, Micah 4:6, where it's, I've taught you, O Israel, what is right and good and how you should do it. It's not this nebulous idea because Micah is actually quoting from Deuteronomy. So, and Deuteronomy and the rest of Torah give very specific things that you should do, like not defraud your brother. Like gives healthy standards, healthy boundaries for human relationships. There's some relationships you shouldn't have. And science is on the side of banning those type of close kin relationships because it leads to very poor mental acuity. It leads to a lot of inherent genetic diseases, and it produces all sorts of problems for that family. So there's so many different things in Torah that when we follow it, it makes us a healthy, strong people. So the idea that you find throughout the prophets is that this latter day restoration, this redemption, is not something that is done by force. God's not forcing a religion on us, but rather it's this idea of an awakening. The fact that we actually look at human history and we go, look at this 6,000 years, or if you want to take the last, 2,000 years, 2,500 years, we can look at Buddhism, we can look at Hinduism, we can look at, traditional Christianity, we can look at traditional Judaism, and we can see that these ways of life have not produced anything that is self sustaining, anything that does not eventually go back and revert back to this chaos of departing from the law. Because that's really what happens when you depart from a very sound constitutional law, like the Torah is, it will go into chaos and it goes into conflict and violence. And that's what we're seeing in Iran right now, because the conflict with the Ayatollah and with that authoritarian regime is ultimately, it's not a conflict with a conflict with the majority of the people who are Persians who have a great affinity with Israel, but rather the conflict is with an ideology. And that ideology is a conflict because it violates the written Torah. And that's what you find everywhere. So, yes, there is this idea that God's going to pour his spirit out upon us. We're going to grow tired. We are going to awaken and we are going to return. And, hopefully conversations like this get people thinking and they're like, okay, maybe just take hold of the possibility, dare to dream that there is something better, because that's how it begins. Martin Luther King Jr., I have a dream. It began with one man and it spread. And that is what we can do today, is it can spread in a heartbeat by everybody taking hold of that covenant and having hope and trusting Jehovah's words.
Yes. And the fact that it's so law-based is the important part, right? When it comes to spirituality, there's a window that like you can basically say anything is spiritual because everything is spiritual. So it's not good enough. You need a precise law book, which is what we have. And so if we're given precise laws and then we have the audacity to say, what should we do? Right? It's like, well, you already know what to do. And like, yeah, don't murder, don't steal, don't commit adultery, like all of these things, and along with the other laws that there's just so they're outlined so clearly. Don't lie. Like that's a law in the Torah. Distance yourself from a false word. Love your fellow as yourself. All of that is in the Torah. And that's why it's so discouraging to see in traditional Judaism and Christianity this departure from the law as being like they're like no, that's you don't need to follow that. I think like Paul says, circumcision avails nothing. Just love Christ. And it's like, what? Like God makes a covenant with Abraham that avails nothing. Like the statements that you see from these commentators, from these figures and their philosophies, they have an aversion to the law. And again, I think it's because they don't want to be bound by God. They want to have the ability to go off into their own tangents. And you see lots of statements like that from the rabbis, like we're the new God, basically. Like we're the ones who have the authority to create law and dictate it and tell you what to do, and you have to listen to us on the basis of what authority? They have no actual authority. It's simply a self-proclaimed, self-referencing system that says, listen to us because we said so, and we're better than you because we came before you and we have a big title. And it's like that's not that's worshiping man. That's not worshiping God. And no matter who comes after, they don't have the right to get rid of what comes first, especially when what comes first is posed as an eternal covenant, an eternal commandment, and coming from God Himself. So I see that as the problem going down the line. And something that's so fascinating to me is even if everything after the Torah was wrong, the Torah itself could still be true, which implies that the foundation is so solid that you don't even need to believe in all the other external texts in order for the fundamental text to be true, because everyone is really commenting on the Torah. So, where do you think you should start at the beginning? You'll probably get it. And as long as people read the Torah without commentary, they'll immediately catch on to the narrative.
Yeah, I find that, and for me, when I had my crisis of faith, one of the first things that I did is I asked, is the law good? Is the law good for humanity? Because that was a real linchpin having believed that the law was there just to show my incompetence. I'm going, okay, would I do that to my own child? Would I teach my child this way of life just to show that he couldn't do it? And so I began to wrestle with those ideas. And even in Judaism, I see, as you say, the same ideas being propagated. So what I did is I wanted something tangible. I wanted to see it for myself. So I started taking the laws, like for instance, kashrut, clean and unclean. I began researching that. And one of the things that I found was a study done by David Mock out of the UK, and where he did tested the toxicity of different animal meats. In every single case, unclean animal meats had a higher toxicity. There were more parasites, there were greater bacterium, there were a whole host of problems with unclean meats that you didn't find in clean meats. Um, when it goes to the instruction of refraining from intercourse during menses, there's a much higher prevalence of cervical and ovarian cancers among women when there is intercourse during menses versus waiting, outside that specified time frame. When it comes to circumcision, which you mentioned a minute ago, there was a study done on 7 continents. It had like almost 1 million people involved in this study, and this study went on for something like 15 years, a very complete study. It found that across every nation, every race, ethnicity, it didn't matter, religion, none of that mattered. If a man was circumcised, there was an eightfold decrease in the rates of STDs, in the rate of HPV, as well as in the rates of penile cancers, and for their female partners, much lower incidences of cervical and ovarian cancers. So I found direct benefits and direct correlation between God says this, it's good for you, do it. And over here, oh my goodness, there's proof that it works. It's a way of life that it doesn't work. It's transformative because it makes us healthy. It can increase our age and help us to live longer. But it's something that we kind of all have to get on board because we do all affect each other. But overall, I found every teaching in Torah to be something that was life-giving, life-sustaining, and produced a much better way of life. So I'm hoping that, as people become aware of this, rather than being scared of it and standoffish, where they say, "Oh yeah, I've got to follow a guy," they're actually going to return to Yahweh. And another point. The other thing that I found is I began to research Israel's healthcare system. And I found that Israel, one of the things that set them apart from other nations, is that in every pagan nation, you always had to have a mediator access the deity for you. If you had a sickness, you had to go to the local priest. He had to do this complex incantation that sometimes involved, duck fat. Sometimes it involved feces, poop, as part of the ritual. I mean, all these things that are very, very unclean. Sometimes, it would touch your skin. Sometimes you would ingest it, or sometimes it would just serve as a vehicle over which you would perform the ritual. But these were very expensive. They made the priesthoods very rich, and you never had access to the deity by yourself. Whereas the religion that God delivered to Israel was direct access. Hannah in the temple, she was able to pray directly to Yahweh. King Hezekiah, he was able to pray directly to Yahweh, and God heard him. This is very much a totally different ideology than what we have inherited today. So for me, I'm very convinced. I'm very fulfilled. I have such a meaningful life and such joy, a joy that can't be manipulated by man because it's founded on the "Thus says Yahweh" in the text.
Yeah. Well, that I mean, that would be the most reliable thing. And by the way, not only are there health benefits, there are spiritual benefits too. Like, just consider the fact that God is telling men to make a covenant with him in the flesh, to take this foreskin, which could essentially be seen as the protection of the male organ, and then you cut that off as a young baby involuntarily, by the way, making that a covenant in the blood. What does that tell you about the severity and the intensity of life and the level of commitment? As far as the refraining from sexual intercourse during the menses, I would count that to be maybe the most difficult commandment in the Torah. Like, it requires extreme restraint, and things like that, like, or for the eating, for example, to really differentiate between what you eat, whether or not you understand the reason exactly. But the point is, it introduces consciousness, it introduces discretion, it introduces restraint. And again, I wouldn't take that advice from a man, but if God is providing those limitations, if God is providing that structure, well, maybe that's a good idea. Maybe that's actually a reliable structure because, as you say, people need structure. They need leaders, they need priests, they need laws, they need courts, but who gets to define the terms, right? Because if we were defining the terms, everything would be bad. But if God is defining the terms, we actually have a chance at having a cohesive narrative that we could unite around. And so I'm curious what you think about the fact that, like, because you mentioned Hannah and Hezekiah, which are like, Jews in ancient Israel, they're praying to Yehovah directly, right? And then 1,500 years later, we're introduced to the idea, oh, but everything you do must be in Jesus' name. Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. Who the hell is Jesus, right? Like, we have a new God now. Like, if you just think about this idea that, like, people are bowing down to a statue that they claim is God in the flesh, which is directly opposed to the Torah, which says God has no form. You cannot put him into a form. You cannot bow down to an idol. God's name is Yahweh. God is one, not three, right? And so, like, and the law is eternal, not negotiable, and, like, to be done away with, which, like, just means that, like, you know you there I want to hear, like, how that aggravated you being part of the Christian world.
Well, for me, I started off when I had my crisis. I just basically threw everything out that I knew. I tried to wipe, just I'm going to date myself here, but it was kind of like, wiping a disk. Remember back in the days where you'd take that floppy disk and you just wipe it clean and then you'd reinsert it and put data back on it. To the best of my ability, that's kind of what I tried to do. I tried not to have an opinion on anything and let the text. So I started in Genesis and I began to build forward. And the book that just came out now is actually kind of my first book because I did have to deal with Jesus quite a bit. And what I found surprisingly is that we have attached so many ideas, the whole concept of what he taught that aren't even there. And when you go back to the text, there's a lot of Torah in it. Even surprisingly, in Paul, there's a lot of Torah. But there's this divergence where it's like you have the A side is very supportive of Torah. It teaches Torah. It's totally 100% completely in line in Torah. But then you flip the record to the other side and you start playing it, and all of a sudden it's being played backwards, and it kind of like repeals and does away with that. So I'm not going to get ahead of where I am in my series because I'm hoping people will consider the evidence. One of the way that I present my work is always to let the text speak for itself. So I present text after text after text. And I presented a lot of texts that challenge traditional ideas on Jesus and on Christianity because there's so much contradiction. There's contradiction within the New Testament, there's contradiction between the Testament and the Torah and the Tanakh. So the question becomes, it becomes this man-made ideology. And where, do we get rid of the former just because something later came along? And when you do that, when you think that Jehovah's word can be rescinded, then you have no concept of truth. Because the very idea of truth is that it is constant, it is unchanging, and that everything else is based on that. So if, as Deuteronomy 13 says, if somebody else comes later on and they say, follow me, I have a new way to teach you, I have this new ideology, this new doctrine, God says, don't follow them because I'm testing you. And we need to wake up to that. We've developed this idea of this lovey-dovey God that just, he wants everything that's good for you. He doesn't ever do anything that's bad. He's just a God of love. He's really this impotent God who can't save you, who just allows, hardship and disease and all these things to come upon you because he's just love. And love really is, it's a feeling and emotion. It's very inactive without having a practical application. So if God is actually a God who tests us, then we need to be very aware of those tests that he sends our way and ask ourselves, okay, Isaiah 8:20, to the law and the adduce to the Torah, and the Torah, if it does not match it, then there's no light in them. If it contradicts, then we need to be careful. And all too often we go with our feeling, our heart, and our emotions rather than taking that test into consideration.
I love that. Well, I mean, the verse comes to mind. Uh, it's in reference to the tzitzit, the fringes on the garments, as you shall see them and remember God's commandments and not pursue after your heart and your eyes, which you stray after them. But I love that you said what happened was you had all this doctrine, all this dogma, Christian dogma, Jewish dogma, all this stuff, pagan, who knows, like what's in the consciousness of people, right? And then you did your best to wipe the slate clean. And once you wiped the slate clean and you revisited the text starting from the beginning, your conclusion was clear. The Torah is the foundation. This is the law. This is what's going on. And everything post Torah is either coming there to support the Torah or to contradict the Torah, in which case it's a problem. And I had the exact same process, as in, I crisis of faith, atheism. I'm done with this. But then, like, okay, I need to rediscover this. I need to actually, have a basis for my life and really understand the Torah. And revisiting it, reading it from the beginning, actually just seeing the narrative of the Bible, it's couldn't be clearer. Couldn't be clearer. The Torah is what we need to be focusing on, and all of every prophet, king, priest worth their salt, worth anything, has one thing to say: follow the Torah of Moses. You have Joshua says that. You have uh, Samuel representing that. You have David saying that to Solomon on his deathbed. You have the prophets afterwards admonishing the people for not following God and not following the Torah. What has the definition of God been? What has the definition of Torah been? The five books of Moses. When Ezra brought the Jews back to Israel, he got up on a platform and just read the Torah of Moses to them. And people are like, oh, Ezra was like a Pharisee. It's like, no, Ezra literally just read the Torah to people. And the Pharisees only came later towards the destruction, right? The Pharisees' rule coincides with the destruction and exile of the Jewish people. So, I don't think there's any coincidences there.
No, no, there isn't. Yeah, actually, the a forthcoming book. So the next series that I have coming out is on the suffering servant. It's a very, very detailed textual analysis of Isaiah 52 and Isaiah 53. And then from there, we go into the day of Yahweh. And in there, I deal a lot with Second Temple Judaism, the development of the different religious factions. And, what I found is actually quite interesting. And I'm not going to get into this a lot but I will just say that the Levites themselves had become corrupt, and that corruption did give rise to sects, as you have in any political situation that counter that and try to meet the needs of the people. But those sects sought power from themselves, and any religious organization, the way you get power to yourself is you have to deviate from the text. You have to create this parallel ideology that is then overlaid the text. And then that gives you your power, your source, and your authority. Because let me tell you, no one's going to understand it until you explain it to them, rather than being able to pick up a Tanakh, read it, and understand it. Now, I totally understand, and this is my approach, that to read it and understand it today, when we are 3,500 years removed from a text, that you can resort to historical studies, read Ugaritic texts or study Ugaritic texts, compare. Like, for instance, for me, one of the things that really caused me to understand and see the brilliance and the love, the justice in Yahweh's law was to compare it with the Hammurabi Code. In the Hammurabi Code, if you stole something, your hand could be chopped off, or
That's
your
in the
ear.
Quran. That's in the Quran.
Yes, in the Quran as well, but it really goes all the way back to the Hammurabi Code.
Interesting.
And so when you look at the parallels of other, the Lipid Ishtar Code, or, Middle Assyrian laws, what you find is that the Torah is absolutely revolutionary. Nowhere else do you have a Bill of Rights for bondservants. I mean, these are people who have no, rule over their own lives, but Torah establishes a Bill of Rights for these people, that if they're hurt, there's certain protections. Not only that, it is the Torah that establishes 1 day a week off, even for your most lowly slave, and even your animals. God cares about animals. So when you look at the Torah, it is such a revolutionary idea. It reforms. So it doesn't like it start from scratch, because it reforms all of the common law that was popular during the day. And God's like, okay, let's set this straight. Okay, you're doing it this way. Let's refine it. This is the way that it really needs to be done to be healthy for society. And the one thing that I think that people miss today so much is that ultimately, when you are walking in Torah, when you are living that life, you have such rich and deep meaning. Nothing compares to it. And that rich meaning provides joy. It's not this happiness like, oh, yeah, today, I feel so good. It transcends that. It's so much deeper because it's constant, it's unwavering. And whether you're having a bad day, whether, the car broke down, or you're transitioning jobs, or you don't like what you do, I mean, those are more surface level things. Yes, they affect our lives, but that deep, rich meaning of joy in your life, something that fills all the cracks and crevices and gives you purpose, it all comes from walking in the way of Yahweh. It comes from walking in the Torah and being in harmony with that natural law that gives us life.
Yeah. And by the way, I love the point you were making about it's not this happy-go-lucky, lovey-dovey nonsense. Like the Torah and the Tanakh, they they satisfy your longing to just what is the truth about God? Like are we just going to say create God in our image and talk about this, projection in the sky of what we wish reality was? Or are we going to have to deal with the hard fact, with the stone cold truth of reality of the fact that God does things that the things he does are beyond our comprehension. He acts with harshness. He punishes. There's definite tests and there's discipline. Yet, as he says, as a man disciplines his son, so does Yahweh your God discipline you. So there's love in that. There's parental guidance. There's the attempt to get us closer to Him through these tests to awaken us. In Hebrew, the word for test and miracle, nis and nisayon, come from the same root of like it's a sign. It's a sign. However you look at it, God is calling out to you. But obviously, that's what's going on. That's what we're looking for. And the verse comes to mind in Deuteronomy. God says, "It shall be as Jehovah rejoiced to bless you when you did good, so will He rejoice to destroy you when you do evil." And now that's something no one wants to talk about. And actually, in the Jewish translations, they mistranslate it deliberately and say something like, "Just as God will rejoice to do good to you, He'll rejoice to destroy your enemies." And it doesn't say your enemies; it says you, right? It says rejoice to destroy you, right? And so what does that mean? It means we better watch out.
It does. And everybody is fearful of that accountability. But there's an underlying misconception, an inherited belief that gives us that fear. And that fear is that we think that when God judges us, it's capricious, it is arbitrary, and that God Himself isn't ruled and isn't limited by His own law. And for me, the way that I see it is that when the text states that Yahweh is righteous, He's righteous for one factor and one factor alone, and that is that He obeys His own law. So even God can't just go out and murder an innocent person. God can't go out and, say, okay, yeah, these were the promises I gave to you, Israel, but you messed up too many times. I'm going to throw you aside and go make a covenant with another people. Um, God is bound to His own words. He's bound to the very laws He gave us, and He can't act arbitrary to that. But that is a good thing because that means that God is trustworthy. God is faithful. We can rely on Him. We can trust Him because He's not going to just zap you because you wore an outfit today that was absolutely hideous, or you dyed your hair, or you maybe even you're in a bad relationship. Those aren't things that God. Yes, you're going to reap and sow what you do in life. But as far as your relationship with God or some sort of judgment that a nation is going to have, it's always going to be in line with the direct written word of you violated this, what I've taught you to do, and you didn't choose the way of peace, but you chose an alternative way of life, and that violates it. And so that's something we can trust. It's something we can rely on, something we can rest in. And we don't have to be afraid of that accountability. Rather, that accountability becomes a source of our strength.
Yeah, and so long as we're all here and we're still alive, it's not over for us. Like God made a flood and wiped everything clean. But then He said He won't do that again. God told the Israelites to essentially murder all of the Canaanites, and that's something brought as an example of God being unjust. Yet at the same time, you don't get to say what is just and what the true judgment is, and at no point in that story is God saying you should go repeat this somewhere else. It's not like a blanket opportunity to go commit genocide. In fact, the same God that says do not murder says to kill the Canaanite nation. So, according to His judgment, which we do not understand, and we would not be able to replicate that judgment because it goes against what He teaches us about murder. Um, Yet in that moment, that is what He commanded us to do. So, we do see that there's a tension in God's judgment, and it's not always understandable to us. I think the book of Job does a good job at highlighting the incomprehensibility of God's judgment to man. Even if we were given a window into heaven and we see God negotiating with Satan, that still doesn't suffice to explain what exactly Job did to deserve this. And God's response to Job is, you don't know. You don't understand.
Well,
You're not God.
so I'm actually delving into this as part of the Suffering Servant series, to which Job is a key player.
Suffering servant, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And there's something that so far I haven't seen anybody. So my approach to scripture is Sherlock Holmes. You have all this evidence. How can you put this evidence together? And there's something that everyone has missed in the book of Job that resolves the conflict and shows that even in judgment, even with Job, Jehovah is righteous and he didn't act capriciously.
Mhm.
So I'm going to leave that as a teaser because it's something that um, I want to give the evidence. I want to be persuasive, not because I think it, not because I believe it or I see it, but because the text itself says it. And you just have to kind of, see things in the right light. If light isn't shining on it, it'll just remain in a dark corner.
Well, maybe I can take a little guess, and you don't have to
Yeah,
spoil the
okay.
teaser. But I think in Isaiah 53, we also see the resolution there, which is something people don't talk about, which is uh, there's a hatred of this life that people have, and it's reflected in religion as well. where they're like, we only live this life to go to heaven, die and go to heaven. And they don't acknowledge that you can achieve the salvation in this lifetime, in this lifespan. And I think that's the story of the patriarchs, where they live out long lives and they have offspring. And they actually, like, even though Abraham is experiencing this wandering and this childlessness, by the time he reaches the end of his life, he's been blessed with everything. Everything's been fulfilled. And what does it say at the end of Isaiah 53? Um, here. So it's Isaiah 53, verse 10. Yahweh desired in his suffering and made him sick, but if he would place his soul as a guilt offering, then he shall see his offspring and have lengthy days, and Yahweh will desire the success in his hand. Right? And then it continues. He will see the satisfaction of his works, and he'll actually reap the benefits of his sacrifice and his suffering, which is not the story of Jesus, if we can just put that out there. I mean, he died. That was the whole story there is that he's gone, right? Like at 30 years old, he's over. He never got married, he never had kids. In fact, he tells his disciples not to get married and have kids, which is against what God says, be fruitful and multiply, cling to your woman, become one flesh. So, but what we're seeing here is he sees his offspring and he has lengthy days, which is the description, and the same thing with Job. Job goes through this terrible suffering, yet God restores him within his lifetime. And he gets to see the entire, he gets to see his suffering come to fruition, where he's put through this test and he comes out better for it on the other side. Whether or not you can explain why it happened, we know that the fact that it happens and the fact that there's a resolution, it's specifically the resolution that's needed in order to make the suffering meaningful. And I think that that's missing, like the suffering in vain idea is not very helpful.
No, it is. Well, it really chips away at the concept of a righteous God.
Hmm.
And that again brings us back to why nobody trusts Israel's God, because they see him as arbitrary, they see him as capricious. And this idea that, especially in Christianity, is that the Father is seen as this harsh, exacting God. I mean, you step out of line and you're going to get it. Well, before Israel entered the promised land, the people had rebelled 14 times. 14 times. And yet God still didn't wipe them out. Now, yes, in the beginning he wanted to. And Moses, was there intervening, saying, all right, cool off, and
He did.
these weren't, little rebellions. These were like, all right, God, you've done all this for us. We're done. We're gone. We don't want you. Yeah, we made this covenant with you, but we're done. So it ignores everything that God had done for Israel up to that
Exactly.
point.
It ignores the role of people in all of this. And I think the Torah's narrative again and again is, you messed it up. God put you in paradise. You messed it up. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. And it also just shows, how much we want to be God, do it our own way, and we never want to relinquish that to try it his way. And again, this comes back to this idea of awakening where eventually we're going to get tired of this. It's called the Titler cycle, where you have great righteousness, great prosperity, and everybody does what's right, and then you get lazy and complacent. Deuteronomy 32 says, Joshua waxed fat and he kicked. He rebelled against this way that God gave him. And we do the same thing. And then we begin this cycle of decline and conflict and chaos. Yeah, there's a genocide, there's a war, there's, tribulation, oppression, whatever. And you come back out of it. When we look over human history, we've been through probably at least probably 40, 50 of those cycles. So at what point do we say enough is enough? Let's try it differently. Let's try something new. Let's see what results we get.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you're very wise to point to the causation behind everything falling apart as if God is just acting out of nowhere. No, the people's rebellion is just shocking. Like when you look at the Israelites' behavior, um, you know, God takes them, they cross the Red Sea. Okay, the entire sea is split. They cross through and then they're like, we need water, we don't have water. We don't like it's like, how about you trust just for a moment that God, the same God who destroyed Egypt with miraculous plagues and took you out, with an outstretched arm and a cloud of glory and split the sea. Maybe he can conjure up some water for you. But it immediately results in complaints, and then they get to Sinai, and God tells them, "Do not worship other gods, do not make idols." And Moses is gone for a little too long. Golden calf, you know. They receive the Ten Commandments. Their immediate response is to worship the golden calf. They arrive at the promised land and they doubt God's ability to bring them into the promised land. It's literally comical, except that is what they did. And so, at what point does the accountability enter the picture? That there's a reason why these things happen, and maybe things could be better, but we need to better ourselves, as God tells Cain. Surely, if you improve yourself, you will be uplifted, you will be forgiven. There will be redemption for you through your own self improvement, not just through you wagging the finger at God and being like, why?
Well, and I think it comes back to Yahweh's overall plan of salvation, where what was the one fatal flaw that we find in Genesis that God noticed about this creature he had created in humanity? That one fatal flaw was that even though everything was perfect in every way, the human heart and mind declined after evil rather than after righteousness and goodness. So throughout human history, we really have struggled with this covenant with death. I see it a lot there's been protests in LA, there's been all of these movements that are so contrary to nature. So even if you take the idea of a God out of it, just how we are innately born, not just as humans, we're born male and female. And in nature, you're born that way. The only way you reproduce, the only way your species survives is through male female reproduction. I'm not going to get into the very small category of asexual reproduction. I mean, that's so small not to even mention it. But the idea is that Yahweh has given us this way of life, but throughout history, and Jeremiah chapter 4 even talks about this, humanity has and desires this covenant with death. Rather than come into compliance, rather than have the accountability, rather than embracing who we really are, we'd rather choose death. And that's just a really sad picture of humanity when you think about it, that rather than doing what mom and dad says, I'm just going to, go knock myself off. But that's really kind of been our attitude. So hopefully, as we gain in wisdom, knowledge, and understanding, and we have a greater appreciation for the text, that those inherited beliefs, those things that have been part of us since creation, will die off. Isaiah talks about Yahweh refining man in the fire of affliction until all the dross, all the impurities, all of the wicked, evil desires, the wicked heart, and deviation of mind.
Well, it says that in Deuteronomy, God says, "I put you in Egypt," which was the iron smelting pot of like the
Yeah,
blacks, right? So he refers to Egypt, which, by the way, was uh, really an unreasonable, like, again, one of those things, like there's no explanation why it had to happen. God just tells Abraham, like, this is going to happen to your offspring, right? And he predicts it hundreds of years before. Yet God refers to it as the smelting pot. There's a refinery going on one way or another within this suffering.
absolutely. And the end goal of that suffering is that Yahweh produces a man more fine than gold. It's a man that, as David, is after Yahweh's own heart, who wants to walk in his ways, who loves it, who loves everything about Yahweh and his teaching so much that, as Ezekiel says, it's written on our very heart. The Torah, the laws, the commandments, they are inward. They become a part of us. And people will say that, oh, that just means, you're in line. It doesn't mean that there's any actual valid law behind it. It's like, well, when you look at the Hebrew there, the use of the word hulk, which are only referring to cultic regulations, and
Priest.
those words are used. When you look at the word Torah, everything there refers And even Ezekiel says it's written on your heart that you may do it. So
Exactly.
if you're doing it, there's something tangible that's there. There's a direct correlation to a written law code where God says do this and we're doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, chok means decree, Torah means law, mitzvah means commandment, and mishpat means judgment. So it's all centered around this judgment, this commandment, in the hopes and the aspiration to do it, to enact it, to actually perform these decrees and carry them out. And again, without the action, it's really not worth much. And I think what you're saying is fascinating about this obsession with death that human beings seem to have. Um, you know, I think they say suicide rates are going up and some frightening rate. And, um, again, people are choosing death when God actually has to tell us, by the way, choose life. Like you'd think that was obvious, but God knows it's not obvious. He knows that we have, a really tough time making the right choice. And so he's trying to help us. Like when you look at the Torah, that one of the things that I felt when reading it was this is just confirmation that the truth is real and God is real and these are actually the right things to do. And you don't have to live in an endless doubt as to what is good or not because you've already been told. Like it is good when men and women are together. It is good when they have lots of children. It is good when society comes together to help those who are less fortunate. It is good when there's sexual purity and morality and there is accountability for crime and there's a justice system and all that. Like, we inherently know that that's good, but we need terms and conditions that are imposed upon us in order to follow it. Because if we were the ones defining it, it would be a mess, which is, what's currently going on.
It is. Well, and you look at whether you're playing maybe a board game or whether you have a computer system, nothing works unless there is an operational code. The rules of the game make it fun. If you're playing a game of Uno and everybody just tosses their cards down at will, okay, I can do that with leaves. I can do that with pencils. What makes that game, make fun for some people. Same with chess. If you're just moving your pieces all over the board, what's the point? Why even bother? But when you get into the rules and the mechanics of chess, oh my goodness, it becomes this game that has captured human imagination for 500 years and brilliant minds in studying the board and learning how to come it. But it's because there are rules that have to be followed. I mean, your knight can't perform the job of a bishop. And if you did, the game would fall apart. It's no longer fun. Same with a computer system. If you go to save a file underneath a particular file folder and it saves it way over here, you're never going to find it. It becomes very worthless. Um, as a side note, there's a fantastic um, program that I would encourage anybody who's ever questioned creationism or questioned evolution. It's put out by the Hoover Institute, and the series is called Uncommon Knowledge. And this particular one has Stephen Meyer, Michael Behe, and John Lennox. And they talk about the complexities of a cell, something Darwin never knew about. And when you get down to that cellular level, we find that when a cell mutates, because a cell itself has thousands, maybe millions of parts that we don't even know about. But when one part of that cell begins to change, it kills the cell. The cell dies. Well, what they show is that these cells, our cells within us, are actually operating on a genetic code. There is a computer program basically within us that is running us. So if God has made us to function on this computer code, and we are introducing things to that code that produce system errors, um, we're not going to get good outcomes. It's going to be this constant bloom, bloom, where we, okay, let's restart, let's reboot. It just gets very counterproductive where we could have something that's a lot more peaceful and a lot more smooth in running in our operating system.
100%. And what's come out of this, scientism, in contrast to creationism, is that it just views creation itself as arbitrary, as in, the mutation and the evolution that happens over billions and billions of years without any divine guiding hand, just says that there's no real genetic code, there's no real structure to existence, and technically things could have evolved a bunch of different ways. And, maybe this works for now, but maybe we should change it too, right? But once you understand that, no, this is deliberate, this is intentional, God created us this way, well, no, actually, the destruction of that would be corruption. And that's what we see by the flood. God says, all flesh has corrupted its way upon the earth. And we see this nowadays with, this idea that, men should surgically alter their bodies to appear as women, and women should surgically alter their bodies to appear as men. That's referred, even just cross dressing is referred to as an abomination in Deuteronomy, let alone actual surgery. But the point is, we see ideologies that are anti-life manifesting in the human mind, in the human consciousness, and that can only happen when there's a disconnect from life itself, where you don't feel that there's a structure that needs to be maintained, and instead, we might as well just mess it all up and let it burn, essentially, because nothing matters. No, like God makes it very clear that he cares what we do. And people are like, oh, what a petty God. He's jealous. It's like, no, well, he's jealous because he cares, right? You're jealous when your spouse, talks to another person is because you love them and you care about them and you don't want what you have together to be robbed. And, God says that in the prophets, to Israel, he's like, you're like a wife who has cheated on me. You're like, you've gone like straight and, committed adultery. Like that's basically unforgivable, yet God is still willing to forgive us and he's still willing to take us back. He's still willing to recall his initial covenant. He's merciful, he's kind, he's slow to anger. That is what he says about himself. That's obviously true. So I think we need to understand that there's a very strict uh, structure that needs to be upheld. And, the world is ordered. Obviously, there's a lot of chaos. God brought order out of chaos. So, there's plenty of, as we talked about, ability to experience varieties of life forms and so much different things going on. But at the same time, let's just be clear that the form and the order that God has set is extremely important to maintain, and He's given us the guidelines on how to do so.
Absolutely. Well, and you know what you bring up about, the transgenderism and all that, it really comes back to the idea that God did create us according to a genetic code. And when we ourselves try to evolve and change that, we do end up dying. We end up destroying what we were. And and I think this is a kind of a segue to a very other important concept, and that is identity. Um, what do you identify with? Who do you identify as? And today, if you have any identity at all, you're going to be attacked, you're going to be demonized. And then all of a sudden you become very able, you're easy to manipulate because you have no identity, or the identity that you have is given to you by somebody in the media or by some political party. Well, when you're walking in the way of Yahweh, when you are obeying in Torah, your identity is so strong. You identify as God's children. It doesn't matter your race, it doesn't matter your ethnic background, it doesn't matter what country you live in. When you are doing Torah, you identify as being part of God's family, as being, whether you see yourself as a convert or somebody who's an Eretz, very native born. Either way, when you are walking in Torah, you're doing it, you're living it. That is such a strong identity. People can't take that away from you. They can't, and I don't. I'm sure you probably read Natan Sharansky, the Fear No Evil, and his time in the Gulag. And what you find is that his belief is so strong, no matter what, the regime would try to do to him, they couldn't break him. They couldn't change him because of the fact that he had a very strong identity. And that is what God gives each of us when he encourages us to obey. So it's just another benefit that makes us strong, makes us wise, and makes us something where we're not easily pushed aside or subverted.
Yeah, I mean, the Torah makes it very clear uh, that we're seeing a narrative that's fundamentally centered around individuals who rise above the mistaken masses to actually develop an identity, and they find all of their strength through God, right? Like Joseph stands before Pharaoh. He's this brilliant young man who's maintained success through the slavery and imprisonment. By the way, completely unjustly. Um, Yet when Pharaoh says, "Look at you, amazing man," he says, "No, God. It's all God. It's all God." And that's the only way to maintain greatness is to actually derive that from God. Deuteronomy says, "Remember Yahweh your God, for He is the one who gives you the strength to perform with valor and valiantly, and to actually be great, to have courage, to have strength, to have virtue, to have talent and ability, to have life itself is from God." And unless we recognize that, yeah, we're either just despairing about life, or we have some sort of delusional ego trip that we just care about our own opinion and our own self. Essentially it's just self worship. Or again, it just comes into worshiping other gods and lesser deities, and which really just diminishes you. And so, like, God is giving us the opportunity to worship the Most High, to be in the image of the Most High, and yet we would choose to descend into the shadows. Like, that's not actually smart. And obviously there's a fascination with darkness, and you know half the day is dark, so it's not like, one of the things I think is interesting, it says God says the light is good, but he doesn't say the darkness is bad, right? So there's a lot of aspects to life. It's not all that clear cut, but some things are clear cut. So if we can maintain the clarity on these fundamental issues, then we have the ability to live the adventure of life, and everything it has to offer.
Yeah, absolutely. Psalm 119, I think for many of us is one of our favorite psalms. And I love David's emphasis on precepts. And this is where I think it really kind of helps to hone in and kind of temper the ideas with the Torah, because when you think of the Torah as being something, oh, God just gave these arbitrary laws, he just had to have something that humanity had to do. Um, when you take the idea that there's precepts, that means there is a guiding philosophy. There's an underlying rule that's working behind the scenes that puts a cohesive picture to the entire Torah, to the entire way of YHWH. And one of those precepts that I have found is that one of the founding precepts of the Torah is that it is meant to be good for humanity. It's meant to benefit us. It's meant to produce life, like Proverbs 12:28 states. And it says it's a way of life wherein there is no death. Well, that's a pretty sustaining life. Um, and when we embrace the good, and we reject the evil, we choose life and we reject death, that process eventually becomes exponential. So, if you have 5 people who start, and then you have 25 people, and then that grows from there, and all of a sudden, before you know it, it's like half the world, it has this love of life. I mean, we've turned from evil to good. We've put everything back in the right order. We're in harmony with natural law, which Torah is. And all of a sudden there's peace, there's harmony, there's happiness, there's joy. There's parents who are capable of actually giving to their children. They're capable of training and raising a healthy generation. But it has to be taken step by step, slow baby steps, and supporting each other, be a friend, phone a friend that, encourages another person to walk in the way, to hold steady. And hopefully there's a lot of shows like, the one we're doing today. Hopefully there's a lot of different community access. There's so many online platforms now that really provide that sense of community. I'm just amazed. I can be talking with someone in Portugal, or somebody in Spain, or even in the UK, and we're really kind of this global community. And it's amazing how Yahweh is bringing us one no matter where we are. We're becoming like this people who value the same ideals, have the same love of God. And it's like our heart is being renewed through this fellowship and through this exchange.
Yeah, and as it should be, and the only purpose of connecting online would be to shut off the phone and the computer and go, enact that in real life, with the people in front of you. And that's obviously what's needed. I mean, people have transferred their lives onto the technology, and they've, forgotten about the life that's in front of them. And like again, the Torah encourages engagement with life itself. The Sabbath is a perfect example of, completely disconnecting from your regular daily activities to immerse yourself in holiness, to immerse yourself in rest and family and the just the life that surrounds you, without having to go do something to change it or even to support it. You just exist. And so much of that is the message of the Torah. Sometimes less is more. Sometimes just enjoying God's creation is enough. And that's to find fulfillment in life itself is really the only way to reject death. Is because if life itself comes out to be meaningless to you, well then what are you pursuing? Why would you sacrifice for God and for life if you don't care about it and you don't find it to be valuable? So yeah, I mean it's directly linked to finding meaning in life to the point that you're willing to actually commit. You're willing to actually commit to God, to actually commit to your soul, and to acknowledge that this existence is meaningful and that there is a lot that needs to be done and that your life has purpose and direction. And it's worth sticking around to get to that point where there really is a change, because all of this war, all of this repetition, it's getting tiresome at this point. Like, who actually wants to go die in another war that could be prevented if human beings just acknowledge their equal desire to not kill or be killed, just to live. But again, it's because we cannot find fulfillment in life itself that we need to resort to all of these other coping mechanisms, which can be quite disastrous.
Mhm. I totally agree. Yeah, we always choose our own ways, and yeah, it always leads to a path of destruction.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, was there any final thoughts?
I think we've covered such a wide gamut, and it's been such refreshing to have a very similar viewpoint, and to have someone who shares that same emphatic love of the written text, of the fact that we can do it and we don't have to rely on man to do it. Um, I think as more of us pop up all over the globe, I think that, just as Esther 4:14 states, it is for such a time as this. And if we've awakened to see this, and if I mean, your listener has awakened to see this, then I think you have been given just a very special gift that should not be hid under a rug. One of the things that it says in Proverbs is that he who wins souls is wise. And if we want this to be something that goes beyond you and me, if we actually want a peace and a truth that is embraced by more than just a handful of people, yeah, you have to share it. You have to be passionate about your love for it, and you have to share it with others, not to lord it over them or hit them over the head with it, but it just becomes something that you have such a deep love about and something that's so good you just want to share it with others. So I would really encourage people to do that because that's how this thing becomes self-perpetuating and how it really begins to take steam. And I think that, it's one of the ways that Jehovah's Spirit is poured out is through that organic energy of us having that passionate love for Jehovah, for what he has taught us, that just attracts other people to something that's so good.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, when you have something good, your immediate reaction is to want to share it. And, I just think knowledge of God and His commandments could only be described as good, and people are resistant to it. I have been resistant to it, and probably still am. Um, you know, for whatever reason, whether you think it's too simple or too harsh or too, but if you really just let it sink in and you really think back to what is the source of all this, where is all this coming from? Where does this consciousness come from? Where does this narrative come from? Where does the history? What are we really living out? It always leads back to the Torah and to the foundational narratives and principles that are introduced to us. And yeah, it starts with individuals, continues with families, communities, nations, and yes, even global, worldwide uh, peace. And the Hebrew word for peace, shalom, also means completion. Like shalem means complete and whole. So that's the way to achieve peace is to have a completion of self and of humanity, where we're all united in the one God. That seems to be a good formula.
I agree.
Okay, awesome. Well, it was really a pleasure meeting you. I encourage the audience to check out your writings and much success with all of your endeavors and your teachings.
Thank you so much. And I hope the same for you. You have a lot going on, and I hope that you are blessed in it.
Amen.
And this thing takes off.
Thank you. Amen. All
And
right. God bless. Have a good day.
you too. Shalom.
Shalom.